Sarah Chen Williams stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror of her Los Angeles office, adjusting her simple silver necklace. Her natural curly hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her navy blazer showed slight wrinkles from sitting through 6 meetings that day. At 34, she had worked tirelessly to build Skyalite Aviation from the ground up, turning it into one of the fastest-growing private jet companies in America. The wall clock read 6:45 p.m. Her phone buzzed again, the third message from New York about an emergency board meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. As both CEO and a licensed pilot, Sarah preferred flying her own jets whenever possible. It gave her a sense of control and reminded her of where she started, flying small planes for regional airlines while dreaming of something bigger. Ms. Chen Williams, her assistant Rebecca, poked her head into the bathroom. "Your car is waiting downstairs. I packed your overnight bag with fresh clothes for tomorrow's meeting, and all the documents are in your briefcase." Sarah smiled tiredly at Rebecca. "What would I do without you?" She grabbed her phone and leather tote bag, heading toward the elevator. The office was quiet now, with most employees gone for the day. Only the cleaning staff remained, nodding respectfully as she passed. In the back of the company car, Sarah reviewed tomorrow's presentation on her tablet. The bright screen illuminated her face in the growing darkness as they drove toward LAX. Her pilot's license felt heavy in her blazer pocket, a reminder of how far she'd come from the small apartment in Michigan where she grew up, watching planes soar overhead and dreaming of flying them herself. The car pulled up to the private terminal entrance at LAX. Sarah gathered her things, thanking her driver James, who had been with the company since its early days. The evening air was cool, and the sunset painted the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. Several private jets stood on the tarmac, including her company's flagship aircraft, a sleek Gulfstream G650 with the Skyalite logo gleaming on its tail. Walking toward the terminal entrance, Sarah's mind wandered to her late father, an immigrant from Hong Kong who had worked as an aircraft mechanic. He had always encouraged her to chase her dreams, even when others said the aviation industry was no place for someone like her. His proud face when she got her pilot's license still brought tears to her eyes, years after his passing. Inside her purse, her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother, checking if she'd eaten dinner. At 65, Mrs. Chen still worried about her daughter as if she were a teenager. Sarah typed a quick reply, promising to grab something on the flight to New York. The sound of jets taking off in the distance filled the air as Sarah approached the terminal's security checkpoint. She had done this hundreds of times before, the same building, the same procedure, the same routine. Tonight, however, felt different. Maybe it was the exhaustion from the long day, or perhaps it was the pressure of tomorrow's emergency board meeting weighing on her mind. Looking down at her simple outfit, navy blazer, white shirt, black pants, and comfortable flats, Sarah almost wished she had worn something more CEO-like. But after 12 years of running her company, she had learned that comfort was more important than appearances, especially on long flight days. She reached for her ID and pilot's license, documents she could probably locate in her sleep by now. The familiar weight of her laptop bag across her shoulder and the rolling suitcase behind her were constant companions in her busy life. The terminal's bright lights cast her shadow long across the polished floor as she approached the security desk. Sarah checked her watch, 7:15 p.m. If everything went smoothly, she would be in the air by 8:00 p.m. and in New York early enough to review her presentation one final time before the board meeting. Little did she know that the next few minutes would turn her routine evening into something entirely unexpected. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the cool air-conditioned breeze hit her face. Sarah took a deep breath, mentally preparing herself for the flight ahead. She had no way of knowing that she was about to face a situation that would not only test her patience, but would eventually lead to significant changes in the private aviation industry. Michael Patterson stood at his post, back straight and uniform crisp. It was only his third week working security at LAX's private terminal, and he took pride in maintaining what he called proper standards. His previous experience as a mall security guard hadn't prepared him for the exclusive world of private aviation, but he was determined to prove himself. As Sarah approached the security desk, Patterson's eyes narrowed. He watched her casual stride, noting her simple attire and lack of the flashy jewelry he'd come to expect from private jet passengers. In his mind, she didn't fit the usual profile of people who belonged in this terminal. "Excuse me, ma'am," Patterson called out, stepping directly into Sarah's path. "This is a private terminal. The main passenger entrance is in the next building." His voice carried a tone of authority that made several nearby staff members look up from their work. Sarah paused, maintaining her composure. She'd encountered similar situations before, though usually not at her own company's terminal. "I understand this is a private terminal," she replied calmly, reaching for her credentials. "I'm Sarah Chen Williams, CEO of Skylight Aviation. I'm piloting the 8 p.m. flight to New York." Patterson's laugh caught her off guard. "Right," he said, drawing out the word. "And I'm the President of the United States." He crossed his arms, locking her path more firmly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." "You are security," Sarah pointed out quietly, pulling out her pilot's license and company ID. "Here are my credentials. You can verify them with your supervisor." Patterson barely glanced at the documents. These could be fake. Do you know how many people tried to sneak into private terminals? Listen, I'm trying to be nice here, but you're clearly lost. The growing scene began attracting attention. Two ground crew members who recognized Sarah exchanged worried glances. A cleaning lady who had worked at the terminal for years stopped mopping, her face showing concern for the CEO she saw several times each week. "Sir," Sarah tried again, her voice steady despite her rising frustration. "I've flown from this terminal hundreds of times. I own the company that operates it. If you'll just call your supervisor." "Own the company?" Patterson cut her off with a scoff. "Look, I don't want any trouble, but you need to leave now. This isn't the place for games." His hand moved to his radio, fingers wrapping around it threateningly. Sarah took a deep breath, remembering similar moments throughout her career, being mistaken for an assistant in her own boardroom, being questioned about her presence in first-class lounges, being asked to prove she was really a pilot. Each time, she had handled it with grace, knowing her response would impact more than just herself. "Mr. Patterson," she said, reading his name tag, "I understand you're doing your job, but you're making assumptions that aren't just wrong, they're harmful. I'm going to ask one more time. Please call your supervisor to verify my identity." Patterson's face reddened. "How do you know my name? Have you been stalking this terminal?" "That's it, I'm calling this in." He grabbed his radio, speaking quickly into it. "I need backup at the main entrance. We have an unauthorized person refusing to leave." The terminal fell silent except for the crackle of the radio and the distant sound of jet engines. Sarah stood perfectly still, her hand still holding out her credentials. Her flight crew waiting by the jet had noticed the commotion and were now walking toward the terminal. Just then, David Martinez, her chief of operations, hurried through the door. He stopped short at the scene before him, his face showing disbelief. "Sarah, what's going on here?" Patterson turned to David, relief showing on his face at seeing someone who fit his mental image of an executive. "Sir, don't worry. I'm handling this situation. This woman is trying to." "This woman?" David interrupted, his voice sharp. "Is my boss and the owner of this entire operation. What exactly do you think you're handling?" The color drained from Patterson's face as the reality of his mistake began to sink in. Behind him, the terminal manager was rushing toward them, having been alerted by one of the ground crew. Sarah Chen Williams remained standing quietly, her credentials still extended, her expression carefully neutral despite the storm of emotions behind it. The terminal manager, Robert Torres, rushed through the growing crowd of onlookers, his face flushed with panic. He had worked at Skylight Aviation for 8 years and knew exactly who Sarah Chen Williams was. She had personally hired him. "Ms. Chen Williams," Torres called out, slightly out of breath. "I am so terribly sorry about this situation." He turned to Patterson, who was still standing rigid, his face now a mixture of confusion and growing horror. "Mr. Patterson, this is Sarah Chen Williams, CEO and founder of Skylight Aviation. She's not only authorized to be here, she owns this terminal." Patterson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. His radio crackled with responses to his earlier call for backup, and 2 more security guards appeared at the entrance, only to freeze when they saw Torres and David Martinez standing there. "I don't." Patterson finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she doesn't look like." "Doesn't look like what, Mr. Patterson?" David asked sharply, taking a step forward. Doesn't look like someone who could own a company, or doesn't look like someone who could fly a plane. Sarah raised her hand slightly, silencing David. The terminal had gone completely quiet, with even the cleaning staff stopping to watch the scene unfold. The only sounds were the distant roar of jet engines and the soft hum of the air conditioning. Mr. Patterson, Sarah spoke calmly, though her eyes were tired. I'd like you to finish that sentence. I don't look like what, exactly? The security guard shifted uncomfortably, sweat now visible on his forehead despite the cool air. I mean, usually, the executives who come through here are what? Sarah pressed, her voice still level but firm. Male? White? Older? Please, help me understand exactly what made you so certain I didn't belong here. Patterson's radio crackled again, breaking the tense silence. He fumbled with it, nearly dropping it in his nervousness. Behind him, several crew members had gathered, many of whom Sarah had personally trained or hired over the years. I made a terrible assumption, Patterson finally admitted, his voice cracking. I was wrong. I am so sorry, Ms. Chen Williams. Sarah checked her watch. The delay was now cutting into her flight preparation time. The board meeting in New York wouldn't wait, even for the company's CEO. She needed to handle this quickly but effectively. Mr. Torres, she turned to the terminal manager, please call Angela in HR first thing tomorrow morning. We need to review our training procedures for all security personnel. She looked back at Patterson, who seemed to be bracing himself for the words, "You're fired." Instead, Sarah continued, Mr. Patterson, I want you to participate in that review. Clearly, our current training isn't adequate in addressing unconscious bias, and your experience tonight will be valuable in improving it. Patterson's head snapped up in surprise. David Martinez started to protest. Sarah, you can't be serious. I am entirely serious, she cut him off. Firing Mr. Patterson won't solve the larger problem. This isn't just about one person's mistake, it's about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. The crowd began to murmur, and Sarah could see phones being pulled out, no doubt to share what they were witnessing. She knew this incident would likely be all over social media by morning, but right now, she had a more immediate concern. Now, if we're done here, I have a flight to prepare for, and a board meeting to attend in New York. She turned to Patterson one last time. Mr. Patterson, I expect you to be at that training review tomorrow. Don't be late. As Sarah finally moved past the security desk, her heels clicking on the polished floor, she could hear Torres already making calls and David giving Patterson a stern lecture about profiling. The other security guards quickly dispersed, and the regular terminal activities slowly resumed. Walking toward her jet, Sarah allowed herself a small sigh. These incidents were exhausting, but she had learned to turn them into opportunities for change. Tomorrow, after her board meeting, she would start drafting a new company-wide training program. But for now, she had a flight plan to file on a plane to prepare. Behind her, she could hear Patterson being escorted to the office for immediate procedural review, his voice shaking as he tried to explain himself to his supervisor. The evening's events would have consequences, but perhaps not the ones he had expected. David Martinez paced the terminal office, his face still red with anger as Torres pulled up the security protocols on his computer. Patterson sat in a chair against the wall, looking smaller in his uniform than he had just minutes ago. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of uncomfortable silence. I still don't understand. David finally exploded, turning to Patterson. How could you not know who she is? Her picture is literally on the wall of this terminal. He pointed to a framed magazine cover showing Sarah Chen Williams standing in front of a skylight jet, the headline reading Aviation's Rising Star. Patterson's eyes followed David's gesture, landing on the photo he had walked past dozens of times during his shifts. The realization seemed to hit him even harder as he recognized the woman he had just humiliated in front of her own employees. The background check you did on him came back clean. Torres asked the HR representative who had just rushed in, summoned by the commotion. Perfect record, the HR rep, Jessica Wam, confirmed. No previous incidents, good references from his last job. She flipped through Patterson's file on her tablet. But I see here he never completed our full diversity and inclusion training. He was scheduled for next week's session. Outside the office windows, they could see Sarah performing her pre-flight checks on the Gulfstream G650. Her movements were methodical and professional, showing years of experience. Several ground crew members hovered nearby, clearly concerned about their CEO after the incident. "She's going to pilot tonight? After this?" Patterson asked in disbelief, watching Sarah inspect the aircraft's wings. "Of course she is," David snapped. "She's one of our most experienced pilots. Has been flying since she was 18. But you didn't bother to check any of that, did you? You just saw what you wanted to see." Jessica held up her hand, interrupting David's brewing tirade. "This is exactly why we need to review our training procedures. Mr. Patterson isn't the first person to make assumptions about Ms. Chen Williams, and unfortunately, he probably won't be the last." The radio on Patterson's belt crackled, making him jump. He quickly turned it off, his hands shaking slightly. Through the window, they watched as Sarah climbed into the cockpit, her movements confident and practiced. "I've worked with Sarah for 8 years," Tari said quietly, still typing at his computer. "She's faced this kind of thing before. Always handles it with more grace than most people would, but that doesn't make it right." Jessica nodded, making notes on her tablet. "She's turning this into a teaching moment, but we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. Mr. Patterson, you'll report to me tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. We're going to go through every detail of what happened tonight." Patterson nodded numbly, his eyes still fixed on the window where Sarah was now communicating with the control tower. The reality of how badly he had misjudged the situation seemed to be sinking in deeper with each passing moment. David's phone buzzed, a message from Sarah. "You read it aloud. Tell Patterson I meant what I said. I expect him to help make our training better. And David, stop yelling at him. Change doesn't come from shame." The message hung in the air for a moment. Patterson's shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and renewed guilt. Outside, the jet's engines began to power up, their low rumble filling the terminal. "She's really not going to fire me?" Patterson asked quietly, finally looking away from the window. "No, she's not," Jessica replied firmly. "But starting tomorrow, you're going to help us understand exactly what went wrong here. Every assumption, every bias, every moment of prejudgment. We need to know it all to make sure our training addresses the real issues." Torres finished typing and turned from his computer. "The incident report is filed. Security footage has been saved. HR will handle the rest." He looked at Patterson. "You have no idea how lucky you are that Sarah Chen Williams believes in teaching rather than punishing." Through the window, they watched as the Gulfstream began to taxi toward the runway, its powerful engines glowing in the darkness. Sarah's voice came clearly through the radio on Torres's desk, communicating with the tower in the precise, professional manner she was known for. As the jet took off into the night sky, Patterson finally spoke again, his voice barely audible over the fading engine noise. "I want to make this right." "Good," Jessica said, standing up. "Because tomorrow, that's exactly what we're going to start doing." She gathered her things and headed for the door. 8 a.m., Mr. Patterson. Don't be late. We have a lot of work to do." At 35,000 feet above the country, Sarah sat in the cockpit of her Gulfstream G650, hands steady on the controls as she navigated through a patch of light turbulence. The digital clock on the instrument panel showed 10:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Her co-pilot, James Thompson, glanced at her with concern. "You're quieter than usual tonight, Sarah," James said carefully, checking their altitude readings. He had been flying with her for 5 years and knew her moods well. That incident at the terminal. "Let's focus on our flight plan," Sarah interrupted gently, adjusting their heading by 2 degrees. The lights of cities below twinkled like fallen stars, a view that usually brought her peace. Tonight, though, her mind kept returning to the terminal. Her phone buzzed in the cockpit, a message from Torres. The terminal manager had sent her Patterson's personnel file and the security footage from the incident. Sarah made a mental note to review them after landing. She needed to understand exactly what had gone wrong to fix it properly. "Control tower reports clear weather ahead," James announced, breaking into her thoughts. "We should have smooth sailing into JFK." He paused, then added, "Most CEOs would have fired him on the spot." Sarah adjusted their cruise speed slightly before responding. "And what would that solve, James?" "Fire one person, pat ourselves on the back, Pretend we fixed the problem." She shook her head. "No, this is bigger than just Patterson." The cabin intercom buzzed. Jennifer, the flight attendant, informed them that the catering they'd ordered for the flight had been prepared. Sarah realized she hadn't eaten since lunch, but the knot in her stomach made food seem unappealing. "I'll handle things here if you want to take a break," James offered. "You should eat something before the board meeting." Sarah nodded, doing a final check of their instruments before unbuckling her harness. As she stepped into the main cabin, her phone buzzed again. This time it was David, informing her that HR had scheduled an emergency meeting for next week to revise their training protocols. The luxury cabin of the G650 was empty except for Jennifer, who was arranging a light meal at one of the tables. Sarah sat down, her reflection in the dark window catching her eye. She looked tired, but determined. "The news is already spreading," Jennifer said quietly, placing a cup of green tea in front of Sarah. She held up her phone, showing a social media post about the incident. Someone had captured a photo of the scene, and it was gaining traction online. Sarah sighed, picking up her tea. "I suppose it was inevitable, but maybe it'll help push the conversation forward." She took a sip, letting the warm liquid soothe her throat. "You know, Jennifer, when I started this company, I thought success would eventually make these incidents stop." Jennifer sat down across from her, breaking the usual staff protocol. They had known each other long enough for such formalities to feel unnecessary. But it didn't, did it? "No," Sarah admitted, stirring her tea. "Sometimes it made them worse. The higher you climb, the more people question how you got there." She glanced at her watch. 3 hours until landing. "But that's exactly why we have to do better. Not just our company, the whole industry." Her phone lit up again, this time with an email from her mother. The subject line read, "Proud of you." Sarah felt her throat tighten slightly as she opened it. Her mother had attached an old photo of Sarah at 16, standing beside her father's maintenance truck at the airport where he worked, both of them grinning at the camera. "Your father would have handled it the same way," her mother had written. "Change comes from teaching, not punishing. He always said that." Sarah touched the screen gently, remembering her father's words. He had faced his own share of prejudice as an immigrant mechanic, but never let it embitter him. Instead, he had focused on teaching, on making things better for those who would come after. "Jennifer," Sarah called as the flight attendant started to return to her station. "Could you ask James to radio ahead? I need to make some calls before we land. We're going to use this incident to make real changes." As the plane continued its journey through the night sky, Sarah opened her laptop and began to type. By the time they landed in New York, she would have the framework for a new training program, one that would address the root causes of incidents like tonight's, not just their symptoms. The city lights below seemed to shine a little brighter as she worked, as if affirming her decision to turn this painful moment into an opportunity for growth. 2 weeks after the incident, Sarah stood at the podium in Skylight Aviation's main conference room. The room was packed with employees from all levels: pilots, ground crew, security staff, office workers, and executives. In the front row, Michael Patterson sat straight-backed in his uniform, looking both nervous and attentive. "Change doesn't come from hiding our mistakes," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "It comes from acknowledging them and learning from them." Behind her, a presentation screen showed the new company-wide training program she had developed. The past 2 weeks had been intense. The video of her confrontation with Patterson had gone viral, generating millions of views and sparking heated discussions across social media. Major news networks had requested interviews, and aviation industry magazines wanted her perspective on discrimination in the field. What happened 2 weeks ago wasn't just about one person or one incident, Sarah continued, clicking to the next slide. It was about unconscious bias, something we all need to address. She glanced at Patterson, who nodded slightly, acknowledging his role in inspiring this change. Jessica Wong from HR stood up next, explaining the details of the new training program. It would be mandatory for all employees, not just security personnel. The program included real-world scenarios, interactive workshops, and regular refresher courses. "Mr. Patterson has been instrumental in helping us understand where our previous training fell short," Jessica explained, surprising many in the room. His willingness to examine his own biases and share his insights has made this program stronger. Patterson shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the attention but determined to see this through. Over the past 2 weeks, he had spent countless hours working with HR, sharing every thought and assumption that had led to his actions that night. "We're calling this initiative Open Skies, Open Minds," Sarah announced, revealing the program's logo on the screen. "Because in aviation, safety comes from checking our assumptions and following proper procedures, not jumping to conclusions." The presentation continued with video testimonials from employees who had faced similar discrimination. A female mechanic described being mistaken for a cleaner. A young black pilot recalled being repeatedly asked if he was lost when walking through private terminals. An Asian ground crew supervisor shared stories of passengers demanding to speak to the real manager. "These stories aren't easy to hear," Sarah acknowledged, "but they're important to share. They show us where we need to improve." She clicked to a slide showing statistics about diversity in aviation. The numbers were sobering, but they provided a clear baseline for measuring future progress. David Martinez took the podium next, outlining the practical changes being implemented. New security protocols would require multiple forms of verification before denying anyone access. Training would emphasize communication skills and professional courtesy. Most importantly, employees would be encouraged to speak up when they witness bias in action. "We're not just changing policies," David explained. "We're changing our culture, and that starts with each one of us." As the presentation concluded, Sarah opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up across the room. Employees shared their own experiences, asked about specific scenarios, and offered suggestions for improvement. Patterson himself stood up to speak, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I want to apologize again, not just to Ms. Chen Williams, but to everyone here," he said. "My actions that night reflected poorly on all of us. But working on this new program has opened my eyes to biases I didn't even know I had." Sarah nodded appreciatively at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. Your honesty in this process has been valuable." She turned to address the entire room. "Remember, the goal isn't to shame anyone. It's to learn and grow together." After the meeting, employees lingered to discuss the new program. Sarah watched from the podium as Patterson engaged in conversation with a group of pilots, listening intently to their experiences. The tension that had filled the room 2 weeks ago had transformed into something more productive, a shared commitment to change. Her phone buzzed with a message from the board of directors. They had unanimously approved the budget for implementing the new training program across all Skylight locations. What had started as an unfortunate incident was becoming a catalyst for industry-wide transformation. As the room slowly emptied, Sarah gathered her materials, feeling both tired and hopeful. On her screen, another dozen interview requests awaited her response. The conversation she had started was spreading beyond Skylight, reaching other companies and industries. "Ready for your next meeting?" David asked, approaching the podium. Sarah nodded, picking up her tablet. "Ready, because this is just the beginning." 3 months after implementing the Open Skies, Open Minds program, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the latest statistics. The changes at Skylight Aviation had caught the attention of the entire aviation industry, and her LinkedIn post about the incident had reached over 5 million views. Her computer screen displayed numerous emails from other CEOs seeking advice on implementing similar programs. Among them was a message from United Airlines' diversity department requesting a consultation. Sarah smiled, remembering how far things had come from that tense evening at the terminal. "Miss Chen Williams," her assistant Rebecca called through the intercom. "The film crew from Aviation Weekly is here for your interview." The magazine had chosen Sarah as their Person of the Year for her innovative approach to handling discrimination in the industry. Before heading to the conference room, Sarah checked her phone. There was a message from Michael Patterson, who had become an unexpected ally in her mission for change. "Just finished presenting our program to the Airport Security Council," this text read. "They want to adopt it nationwide." The conference room had been transformed into a temporary studio. As Sarah entered, she noticed the magazine cover mock-up displayed on an easel. The headline read, "Changing the Face of Aviation, How One CEO's Experience Transformed an Industry." Ms. Chen Williams, the interviewer, Janet Roberts, stood to greet her. "Thank you for making time for us. Your story has inspired so many people. She gestured to the chairs set up for the interview. Shall we begin? As the cameras rolled, Janet asked about the viral incident. Sarah leaned forward, speaking with conviction. What happened that night wasn't unique. What was unique was our response to it. Instead of firing one person, we chose to educate everyone. The interview covered the impressive results of the past 3 months. Employee satisfaction scores had improved by 40%. Reports of discriminatory incidents across all Skylight locations had decreased by 65%. Most surprisingly, job applications from minority candidates had increased by 200%. The numbers are encouraging, Sarah explained, but the real change is in the daily interactions. Our employees now feel empowered to speak up, to question their own biases, and to help others learn. During a break in filming, Sarah's phone buzzed with another notification. A major aerospace manufacturer wanted to partner with Skylight to create an industry-wide mentorship program for underrepresented groups in aviation. Your story has resonated with so many people, Janet commented as the cameras resumed rolling. Why do you think that is? Sarah thought for a moment before responding. Because it's not just my story. It's the story of every person who's ever been told they don't belong somewhere. But instead of letting that moment defeat us, we used it to create change. The interview shifted to discussing the future. Sarah revealed plans to establish a scholarship foundation for minority students interested in aviation careers. The foundation would cover flight school costs, maintenance training, and other educational expenses. Michael Patterson will be on the foundation's advisory board, Sarah announced, causing Janet's eyebrows to rise in surprise. His perspective as someone who confronted and overcame his own biases is invaluable. After the interview, Sarah walked through the terminal where the incident had occurred. The space had been redesigned to feature a wall of photographs celebrating diversity in aviation history. Beside each photo was a QR code linking to the person's story. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her mother. She had attached a photo of Sarah's father's old toolbox, now displayed proudly in the company's museum. You would be so proud, the message read. You didn't just open doors, you're teaching others how to keep them open. Back in her office, Sarah reviewed the draft of her upcoming book, Higher Ground, Transforming Conflict into Change. The manuscript detailed not just her experience but included stories from throughout her career and the aviation industry. Rebecca entered with the afternoon schedule. The diversity training session starts in 10 minutes, she reminded Sarah. Mr. Patterson is leading it today. Sarah gathered her materials, feeling a sense of accomplishment. What had started as a painful incident had grown into a movement for change that was spreading far beyond one company or industry. As she walked to the training room, she passed the spot where she had stood that fateful night. The space felt different now, not a place of confrontation, but a point of transformation. Through the windows, she could see planes taking off into the clear blue sky, carrying with them the promise of change. 1 year after the incident, Sarah Chen Williams stood on a stage at the National Aviation Conference, looking out at a sea of faces representing every major airline and aviation company in the country. Behind her, a large screen displayed the logo of the newly launched Aviation for All initiative. 1 year ago, an incident at my company's terminal could have ended with anger and dismissal, Sarah began, her voice carrying through the packed auditorium. Instead, it became the catalyst for the largest diversity initiative in aviation history. In the front row, Michael Patterson sat wearing a new uniform, no longer a security guard, but the director of diversity training for Skylight's national program. Next to him sat 20 graduates from the first class of Sarah's Scholarship Foundation, their pilot and engineering certificates fresh in their hands. Today, I'm proud to announce that Open Skies, Open Minds has been adopted by over 200 aviation companies worldwide, Sarah continued, revealing the statistics on the screen. But more importantly, we're seeing real change in our industry's culture. The numbers told an impressive story. Industry-wide hiring of minority candidates had increased by 85%. Customer satisfaction scores had improved across all participating companies. Employee retention rates had risen significantly. What had started as one company's response to bias had grown into an industry-wide transformation. And now, we're taking the next step, Sarah announced, clicking to a new slide. The Aviation for All initiative will create training centers in underserved communities across the country, providing free aviation education and career guidance. The audience burst into applause as Sarah introduced her partners in the initiative: major airlines, aerospace manufacturers, and aviation schools. Each had committed substantial resources to making aviation careers accessible to everyone. David Martinez, now Skylight's Chief Diversity Officer, joined Sarah on stage. "This program isn't just about flying planes," he explained. "It's about maintenance, engineering, management, security, every aspect of aviation. We're opening all doors, not just some." From his seat, Patterson watched with pride. His own journey had become a case study in transformation. He now traveled the country sharing his story, helping other companies understand how to recognize and address unconscious bias. "Mr. Patterson's experience taught us something valuable," Sarah acknowledged, gesturing toward him. "Change is possible when we're willing to learn from our mistakes and do better." He didn't just learn, he became a teacher. The presentation shifted to video testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the past year's initiatives. A young black woman who had become a certified aircraft mechanic, a Hispanic teenager who had earned his pilot's license through the scholarship program, an elderly Asian man who had finally received recognition for 30 years of ground crew service. Sarah's mother watched from the audience, tears in her eyes as she clutched an old photograph of her late husband. On stage, Sarah held up her father's worn mechanic's wrench, a reminder of where her journey began. "This wrench belonged to my father," she explained, her voice soft but strong. "He taught me that the sky belongs to everyone. Today, we're making that lesson a reality." The conference concluded with the signing of the Aviation Equality Pledge by representatives from every major aviation company. They committed to maintaining diverse hiring practices, providing inclusive training, and supporting aviation education in underserved communities. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the conference center, stopping to talk with scholarship students and industry leaders alike. Her phone buzzed constantly with congratulatory messages and news alerts about the initiative's launch. "Ready for your flight back to LA?" David asked, approaching with their schedules. Sarah nodded, checking her watch. "Is the new trainee pilot ready?" "Maria, yes, she's doing her pre-flight checks now." David smiled. "First graduate of our program to pilot for the CEO." As they walked to the terminal, Sarah passed a wall of photographs, the same ones from her company's terminal, now displayed at airports nationwide. Each image told a story of aviation's diverse history and promising future. At the plane, Maria Rodriguez, a young pilot from the scholarship program, stood confidently in her captain's uniform. "Ready when you are, Ms. Chen Williams," she said proudly. Sarah climbed aboard, remembering her own first flights and the barriers she had faced. Now, watching Maria prepare for takeoff, she saw the future she had worked so hard to create, one where talent and dedication mattered more than appearance or background. As the plane lifted into the sky, Sarah looked down at the conference center growing smaller below. What had started with a confrontation at a terminal had grown into a movement that was changing not just an industry, but countless lives. The sky, finally, was truly becoming open to all.